Hugo is the third ice DPS to be released in ZenlessZoneZero, but make no mistake, he is easily one of the most unique. Unlike other attack agents, he completely transforms what it means to use the stun meter, and as a result, I decided to test every team composition that could possibly include him. With that, today I'll be showing you how to play him, what his strengths and weaknesses are, and what my final results were after testing him. But guys, as usual, the goal of today's video is to give you context for whether Hugo is worth it on your account. I'd like to remind you that all the footage from this video will be from the creator beta server, so things are subject to change. But with this out of the way, let's break down every Hugo team in ZenlessZoneZero. Hugo's gameplay revolves around one major mechanic and really isn't as complicated as he seems. In short, Hugo aims to stun the enemy, buff himself, and use a finishing move from either his EX special attack or ultimate to activate a new mechanic known as Totalize that consumes the daze meter for an insane burst. But to give a bit more context, Hugo's goal is to reach the stun state with his team, perform a chain attack with Hugo specifically to gain the crit rate and crit damage buffs from his core passive, perform a second chain attack with the chain attack cancel trick to avoid using low damage chains from his allies, finish his combo by using his EX special attack or ultimate to detonate the stun bar for massive damage as previously mentioned. Now let's talk about his actual kit mechanics. As usual, this section is just for briefly explaining and summarizing Hugo's mechanics, while the actual full breakdown will arrive once his guide is released, so stay tuned. With that, let's start with Hugo's core passive. Hugo's core passive makes him a stun focused burst DPS, and when he lands a chain attack or stuns an enemy, he gains a buff for 6 seconds that boosts his crit rate by 12% and his crit damage by 25%, refreshing on each trigger. In addition to this, if Hugo has 1 or 2 stun agents on his team, he gains an extra 300 or 900 attack depending on which of the conditions he meets. Beyond these buffs, however, is his major mechanic known as Totalize. The way it works is that when his EX special or his ultimate hits a stunned enemy, it increases this finishing move's damage by a flat 1000% bonus plus more based on remaining stun time, scaling up to a total of 3400%. To add to this, the remaining stun bar will be consumed upon completing the EX or ultimate in exchange for a massive burst of damage. In addition to this, however, any leftover time from this Totalize will turn into days up to 25%, allowing Hugo the ability to reach his next stun phase much easier. Next, let's break down Hugo's additional ability, Prelude to Finality. This activates when Hugo is paired alongside another stun character or someone who is ice, but when active, his chain attack deals 15% more damage and an extra 35% against non-boss/elite enemies. When Totalize is triggered, this additional ability also gives the skill a 40% damage boost, and in addition to this, Totalize triggering on a normal enemy using his EX special will also generate 20 bonus energy once every 30 seconds. Now, let's break down his actual abilities and moveset. Hugo's basic attack combo is pretty interesting as Hugo gains the ability to perform a charge shot if he holds down the basic attack input after the 4th part of his basic attack combo. But in truth, Hugo doesn't nearly provide as much value from using this basic as opposed to spending time on other agents so that he can generate days faster. Now let's talk about his EX special attack. Hugo's EX special is pretty similar to other attack agents' EX specials, but the main difference here is that Hugo's EX special attack can trigger Totalize, dealing massive damage in a short period of time. Side note, his EX special can be directly followed up with the 4th hit of his basic attack, but again, this is honestly less impactful than you'd think. Hugo's assists and dodge both also allow him to use a charge shot, but similarly, this is not as relevant unless spending more time on field with Hugo, as his goal otherwise is to simply get to the stun phase of any enemy. That said, if you are spending time with him on field, these shots are notably stronger than the shot he gains from his 4th basic attack, so do with this what you will. But then we have Hugo's chain attacks. As per his core passive, performing chain attacks is very important for him since the added crit rate and crit damage adds to his overall DPS, but more importantly, performing chain attack cancels and allowing Hugo 2 additional chain attacks as opposed to just 1 will also grant him the chance to deal added damage and refresh the duration of his enhanced state that of course grants him said bonus stats. Hugo's ultimate also shares the same trait as his EX special, dodge, and assist skills in being able to transition to the 4th part of his basic attack, but once again, this is not as relevant in his overall game plan. Instead, this ability is one of his highest priorities for Hugo to activate Totalize with, as the damage he deals when consuming the stun meter with an ultimate based Totalize is massive. Before I break down the findings from my team research, let's take a moment to re-explain the format of this testing. First, the teams listed in this next section always had Hugo's additional ability active, and second, I tested both double stun and stun plus support teams with Hugo as well, regardless if I could potentially lose some attack in the process. Next, let's talk about the standards and setups I used. The following teams had M6 on A ranks, M0 on S ranks, and the signature W engines / reasonable options for every single character. That of course means that a character like Rena would have her signature, and someone like Lucy would have something like Kaboom the Cannon, but as always, additional changes were sometimes made if results skewed things to be unrealistic. On a final note, these findings will always need more context because things like the encounter, the boss, an enemy's stun meter, their buffs, and other factors can affect the actual results. With this, the first team type that I used with Hugo was a double stunner composition, since his kit synergizes with 2 Daze agents, and Hugo benefits greatly from stunning enemies as often as possible for his totalized mechanic. Now, after extensive testing with this, I did find that Hugo was best paired with Lighter, and this made sense given the added stun duration and bonus damage that Lighter provides to ice agents. However, it is also worth mentioning that Trigger, Lycone, and Qingyi were all very powerful, assuming that Lighter was already on the team. In terms of how they felt to play though, all variations of Lighter teams felt strong, assuming Lighter's unique resource was being managed effectively, but more importantly, just having the damage buffs from Lighter made clearing content like Shiyu or Deadly Assault a breeze with this lineup. To be more specific for performance, however, Lighter-based teams were typically 15 to 20% faster than teams without him. Now, I do have 2 disclaimers I want to mention regarding Qingyi and Trigger, and it's actually in regards to their play and performance combined. To start with Qingyi, her performance was very straightforward and simple when paired with Hugo, but it's important to note that Qingyi's performance was much better in shorter encounters or when bosses were cleared and a lower number of stun cycles. What this means is that Qingyi had a much better showing in content like Shiyu defense, where the boss had much less health and the content was more focused on speed clears. This is reflected both in her impressive Shiyu defense clear time, but her also notably lower deadly assault scores, which again makes sense given her gameplay identity. Next, regarding Trigger, it is worth mentioning that Trigger and Lighter paired together did feel slightly uncomfortable, since both Trigger and Lighter aim to stay off field until their unique resources or gameplay goals are met, and while normally this wouldn't be an issue, it does take time for Lighter to fill his unique resource, and Trigger does also want to support the team through her off-field aftershock attacks, which inevitably resulted in Hugo spending extra time on field, performing attacks that were honestly very unimpressive and didn't do much. That said, once Trigger's attack started flying and Hugo was able to start building Lighter's resource gauge, the team dealt an amazing amount of damage and was one of the highest scoring teams in the Deadly Assault category especially. Now, though it's clear that Lighter is the best partner for Hugo, I did test other teams without him in case you weren't looking to pull for him in his rerun banner. Hugo, Qingyi, Trigger, Hugo, Lycone, Qingyi, and Hugo, Lycone, Trigger were 3 teams that I also found to work with Hugo in the double stun category, but it's true, with the release of several new limited stunners, they all have much better kits and buffs than older agents like Kaleda or Ambi. This isn't necessarily surprising though, since characters like Ambi are A ranks and Kaleda's buffs are pretty specific and mediocre overall, but now it's time we talk about the feel and performance of the teams we mentioned earlier. For those of you who pulled for Qingyi around Zhiyuan's banner, her playstyle will feel very comforting and easy when pairing her with Hugo, and thankfully, even her performance in Deadly Assault was still decent, as she managed to outperform most teams by roughly 2 to 5%. That said, most of her standout performances were still after being paired with other limited stunners like Trigger or Lighter, and on the topic of Trigger, she was definitely the easiest of these stunners to use with Hugo, as she spent little to no time on field. Lycone also had a great showing in terms of buffing for Hugo, but playing Lycone did feel more intense, as dazing with him was much more involved than with Trigger. Overall though, Lycone and Trigger had similar clear times to Qingyi, though all teams had specific lineups that caused their times to be slower on occasion. With all this, I do have 4 teams that I would recommend for those of you looking to try a double stunner team with Hugo, but of course we have to set some guidelines. If we're including Lighter, Hugo, Lighter, Trigger, and Hugo, Lighter, Lycone were clearly much better than the rest of his teams. However, if we're excluding Trigger, Hugo, Lycone, Qingyi, and Hugo, Trigger, Qingyi were both amazing as well. Now, despite Hugo seeming to need 2 stunners on his team, I still wanted to test to see if missing 600 attack could be compensated for by another support or some other buff. And with this, these were my findings for the best stun plus support teams involving Hugo. The best teams, to likely no one's surprise, were Hugo, Lighter, Astra, Hugo, Lighter, Caesar, and Hugo, Lighter, Nicole, but interestingly, only the Astra and Caesar variations of these teams performed successfully in Deadly Assault. Now, to be clear, all three teams had fantastic showings in shorter content like Shiyu Defense, but it is worth mentioning that they unfortunately fell short in content that lasted longer. That said, their clear speeds were still overall roughly 9 to 14% faster than the others in shorter content, and for what it's worth, this is quite impressive despite the team missing 600 attack from Hugo's passive. In terms of feel, all three teams were also very comfortable to play, as using EX specials or performing chain attack cancels in these lineups were very smooth, but otherwise the results of these teams were to be expected. Strong limited characters performed better than standard agents. This next part is where things got very interesting, however, as using non-limited agents in these stun plus support lineups had very different results. For clear times, the best teams were Hugo Chingy Nicole, Hugo Lycone Nicole, and Hugo Lycone Lucy, and for transparency's sake, these teams were very competitive to most teams, with them only being a few percent worse than their peers. However, when taken into Deadly Assault, the gap between these teams and the double stun lineups were much more noticeable. In fact, the difference between standard teams without two stunners compared to ones with was 25% on average. This means that using a non-limited team composition with a stun plus support comp may end up clearing content with lower health in content like Shiyu Defense, but this might not be the case if you challenge something like Deadly Assault. After all this, however, my recommendations for stun plus support teams was still the following. Using any limited support like Astra or Caesar will yield great results for Hugo, but to be honest, using non-limited agents will definitely cause Hugo teams to struggle when used in longer duration content. As a result, in terms of teams, I would definitely recommend using Hugo Lighter Caesar or Hugo Lighter Astra if you have access to these agents, and otherwise using Hugo Chingy Nicole or even Hugo Lycone Nicole if you're missing the limited agents will be fine, assuming you don't try to push your limits too hard in endgame modes like Deadly Assault. Finally, however, the best team for Hugo is actually more complex than I originally thought. Hugo Lighter Lycone, Hugo Lighter Trigger, and Hugo Lighter Astra were all fantastic teams in terms of score and clear speed, but once again, the difference between these teams in terms of score or clear speed were actually not nearly as important to me as comfort when playing them. As a result, I actually recommend testing all three of these teams to see which feels the most satisfying, since all teams do perform quite well regardless of the content that you're using them in, and instead I actually find it way more important to find out which team you're the most comfortable using, as otherwise your scores will definitely suffer. Now that the teams and kits have been explained, let's talk about Hugo's pre-farm materials. To upgrade Hugo, you'll need the following: 3,705,000 Dennies for upgrading his skills and ascensions, 30 Pioneer Seals, 32 Advanced Attack Seals, and 4 Basic Attack Seals to ascend Hugo to level 60. In order to level him to 60, you'll also need 300 Senior Investigator Logs, and moving past these materials, you'll also need 250 Specialized, 75 Advanced, and 25 Basic Ice Chips, alongside 5 Hamster Cage passes for all of his skills to be leveled to 12. To completely upgrade his core passive, you'll need 9 Finale Dance Shoes from the Twin Marionettes, and at the end of it all, you'll need 60 Murderous Obituary drops from Dullahan in the Expert Challenge. Now, if you're looking to pull and upgrade his signature W engine, you'll also need 400,000 Dennies, 30 Specialized, 32 Reinforced, and 4 attack components, and alongside this, 200 W engine energy modules to level the engine to max. Now, unfortunately, Hugo doesn't actually have a perfect, amazing set for him currently, and as a result, he has to choose between Hormone Punk and Woodpecker as his decent but not amazing 4-piece set options. In case you're curious about Polar Metal, however, that set also doesn't work amazingly for Hugo, as he doesn't really prioritize using basic attacks or dash attacks, given the fact that his damage share is mostly fixated on Total Eyes, his EX special attack, and his ultimate. That said, for his secondary set, using anything between Woodpecker, Hormone Punk, Branch and Blade, or even Puffer Electro can work, but as always, picking the set with the most usable roles is what I would recommend. For W engine choice, his signature is easily his best option, but if you aren't planning on pulling for it, Heartstring Nocturne as a general stat providing W engine, and Haramasa's signature W engine as well if you can maintain its passive, is decent too. For clarity, these W engines only end up being anywhere between 15 to 20% worse than Hugo's signature. If you're curious as well, Ellen's signature is also an interesting option, as the crit rate is valuable, assuming again you can maintain this passive. Regarding A rank engines, however, Marcato Desire, Gilded Blossom, and Starlight Engine are all great choices for Hugo, but in addition to this, Street Superstar is also a decent option too, especially if you're planning to make use of the chain attack cancel that I mentioned earlier. Finally, however, here here are the pros and cons for Hugo after my extensive testing with him. For the pros, he is easily one of the most unique DPS that ZenlessZoneZero has ever released. And for those of you who have missed Miyabi or Ellen, Hugo is a fantastic ice DPS who does have competitive damage and a decently simple playstyle too. His additional ability also works perfectly with his kit and his ideal supports, as old and new stun characters alike both activate his additional ability regardless of how actually impactful they are. In addition to this, without Miyabi or Ellen, he's really the only ice DPS that we have access to aside from Sokaku, who only really works as a DPS at M6. But finally, his animations also look pretty cool and flashy, which is pretty surprising for a character like him, as I was originally not super sold on his character identity. I was wrong though. Moving along to his cons, he isn't Miyabi, but this being a weakness is honestly pretty unfair to Hugo since no characters are on her level as of now, and as mentioned earlier, him not having a perfect disk drive set to make use of does feel kind of bad and does make him feel a bit similar to Evelyn as we've felt previously. In addition to this, his damage and playstyle outside of stun/totalizing really doesn't feel satisfying, as all of his damage is focused on the stun window exclusively. But to be honest, Hugo isn't really a character that has many weaknesses, as he's just a solid DPS who does honestly fill the role of a decent ice damage dealer. That's gonna be it for today's video though, guys. I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. Check out the rest of my socials if you haven't already. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.